Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. Today's topic is one of those topics that's probably one of the most important things I'll ever cover, and yet it's one of those things that doesn't really get spoken about enough. It's applicable to nearly everyone, and yet it's critical to the long-term success of your aquarium. So firstly, I'd like to show you a very simple little demonstration. If you imagine this bowl is your aquarium, and these white nuts are actually water. So when you fill your aquarium, you put water into the aquarium. But what many people don't realise is that dissolved in the water are actually lots and lots of different minerals, things like calcium, magnesium, sodium and the like. And so if you think of these brown nuts as actually all the minerals that are dissolved in the water actually looks a little bit more like this. It's actually a mix of water and all kinds of other elements dissolved in it. Now, when water evaporates from the tank, it's actually only the water that evaporates. These minerals and things are actually left behind. So if we remove 5 of the white nuts for the moment to represent the water that's actually evaporated, you can see the concentration actually changes a little bit. Now, when you top the tank back up, basically if we put the 5 white nuts back in again, you actually have to put 5 of the brown nuts in to actually make up the actual minerals and things that are dissolved in the new water. Now, as you can see, the concentration is now starting to increase of the brown nuts to the white nuts, and this process will continue. So each time you get more water evaporating, so let's take out the white nuts again, and then you top the tank back up, you put the white nuts back, and more of the brown nuts representing the minerals go back in again. You can see the concentration of brown nuts is really increasing. And this is basically what happens in an aquarium, that the minerals represented by the brown nuts actually build up more and more over time, and this can have a really negative effect on the tank because your water is basically becoming harder and harder and saltier until eventually it reaches a point where it actually can cause you problems. I should clarify that this doesn't exclusively apply to tap water. It actually applies to most water sources, and especially hard water ones. And as tap water is the most common, I chose that as an example. But primarily, it applies to pretty much any groundwater source, whether that's tap water, well water, pond water, river water, etc. But it can apply to pretty much any water source. But it's very much worth being aware of wherever your water supply actually comes from, as it has a profound effect on the long-term success of your aquarium and certainly its inhabitants, especially as it has all kinds of health implications which ultimately shorten the life of your animals and your plants. And over the years, and especially from my shop days, I've seen this happen so many times. I've seen so many tanks fail simply because of this. So really the main purpose of this video is simply to show just how easy this is to avoid. Many of you, I'm sure, will have come across the term old tank syndrome, and this is actually certainly part of old tank syndrome as people perceive it, and it's certainly one of those things that does occur in many tanks, and as I say, is classically preventable. And you'll find that there are sort of certain, I would call, classic symptoms of this. Probably the first and most well known is when you buy fish and you find that the new fish are actually struggling to settle into their new environment, or even the new fish are actually dying and the old fish are actually still surviving. You'll find that the old fish to some degree actually adapt to these conditions, although it may not be doing them any good, whereas it's simply too much of a shock for the newly introduced fish. But you often also find that you have terrible problem in actually growing plants, and you get all kinds of algal problems. But one of the really kind of slightly strange thing which puzzles a lot of people is if you were to do the sort of normal water tests, just in normal sort of pH, ammonia, nitrite and nitrate, it's perfectly possible to have all of these levels come out perfectly normal, and yet you're still getting endless issues, as I say, particularly with introducing new fish, but it can show itself in all kinds of ways. It's kind of like a silent killer that doesn't show up on these tests, although it will to some degree show up on hardness water test kits. But the results can actually be a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with how to actually interpret them. And as I say, I used to see this a lot from my customers in the old days. Customers would get really frustrated because they do all the usual water tests and everything would come out perfect. except they were having constant issues with all kinds of different things. So anyway, in order to show you some slightly more clear sort of examples of maybe the more extreme symptoms, I've actually been running an experiment on one of my tanks, especially for making this little video. This particular tank has actually just been topped up with tap water for literally only 3 months. And even in this incredibly short period of time, the mineral content of this water has actually more than doubled. And in actual fact, it's now so high that some of the minerals are actually starting to precipitate out on the back wall of the glass. And I'm not sure if you can see this very clearly because my phone doesn't pick it up terribly well. But ultimately, this precipitation on the back, it will actually form sheets. I've actually done this before in the past, and the sheets can actually become thick enough that you can actually pick them up when they fall off the back of the tank. It's quite incredible to see. But you can also see in this tank, if you look closely, that there are actually lots of chalky-like deposits actually on some of the plant leaves. Now, part of this is actually something called biogenic decalcification, where the plants are actually utilising bicarbonates as a CO2 source. But in really extreme examples like this, it's not a good thing. It's just too exaggerated. And you can see that the plants are actually clearly struggling to cope with the amount of minerals. And it's important here at this point anyway, to realise that only certain minerals will precipitate out in this way. Mainly things like calcium and magnesium. But mostly, and sort of most notably, things like sodium don't precipitate out. They actually stay in the water. So although you might not realise it, it's actually surprising how much salt there actually is in many water supplies. And just as an example, my water supply here, it actually has really quite a lot of salt in it. So in theory, if I was to top up my tanks indefinitely with my tap water, I'd eventually end up with something that is really not that dissimilar to the Dead Sea. And as the name suggests, nothing will grow in that or survive in that. So obviously you don't want your tank going anywhere near those kind of circumstances. Fortunately, there's a really easy and very inexpensive way of making sure that you spot this issue long before it actually becomes a problem. And that's simply to use something called a TDS meter. Now, I'm sure some of you are familiar with these, but for those who aren't, you can actually pick these up incredibly cheaply online. I think I paid about £5, which I think is, what's that, about $6 or $7 for mine. It's, as I say, a very cheap, simple little electronic device. Now, TDS actually stands for Total Dissolved Solids. And I'll put this really simply, but what these meters do is they actually measure how much electricity the water is conducting in your aquarium. Now, those of you who remember your very first science lessons will probably remember that pure water doesn't actually conduct electricity at all. So pure water, H2O that is, actually has a TDS of 0. And it's only when you dissolve or add things to that water does it actually start to conduct electricity. So you could say it's the impurities in the water that conduct electricity, and not actually the water itself. Fortunately for us aquarists, almost everything that dissolves in water or can be found in water actually conducts electricity, which means that it'll be detected by these TDS meters. Now, while these TDS meters don't actually tell you what's building up in your water, you can pretty much guarantee that it's not good if it continues to rise, and it's certainly not going to end well if you leave it to rise unchecked. Okay, so I'm sure you're thinking by now, what should my TDS be? What is the correct level for TDS? Well, I'm desperately trying to keep this video as simple as possible, so I'll keep it super simple and basic for now. For the vast majority of people, the most important thing here is really just to keep the TDS stable. So generally speaking, fish are actually quite adaptable and will actually do quite well in really quite a wide range. However, wild fluctuations and ever-increasing levels will be very problematic, especially in the long term. I'm not going to go into specific levels for different species here, as it'll be way too complex and take way too long. So it's just really going to be very much a generalisation. Subsequently, in most cases, I would simply suggest test the TDS of your water supply, and then aim to keep your water around that level. Again, generally speaking, I wouldn't suggest trying to deliberately manipulate your water to actually a specific level. It's really only something that if you're wanting to breed a specific fish or do something really specific that you want to get involved in. For the vast majority of people, it's much simpler and much easier to simply work with what you have. And that's really basically all I've done with this 28-year-old tank over the years. At the end of the day, it's really stability that is way more important than chasing particular levels. But as I say, you really want to avoid it creeping up, as it will definitely come back and bite you sooner or later. So just as a very simple example, if your water comes out of the tap with a TDS of, let's say, 200, you want to try and maintain it around that level. So let's say somewhere between 180 and 220 is a very rough guide, but it's not an exact science, and as I say, just work around the level that you have. So I guess the really big bit is, how do you maintain the tank long term without these minerals building up? And especially with a 28-year-old tank like this that hasn't had a meaningful water change since 2010, that makes it that bit more complicated. Anyway, by far the easiest way to prevent this is simply to avoid topping off with water that contains all of these minerals. Now, there are quite a few and some very obvious sort of options here. I'll just run through a few of the most common. Firstly, for topping off, you could use RO water, deionized water, distilled water, or even rainwater. Personally, I tend to use rainwater simply because it's free and it falls out of the sky, it's available, so it's very easy. But you do have to be aware, if you use rainwater, that in some locations rainwater can contain certain pollutants, etc. So in a similar vein, just test the TDS of your rainwater before you use it. And my kind of little rule of thumb here is I only use rainwater if the TDS is below 50. If it's above that, then I tend to dump the water and wait for the rain to come again, and normally for the wind from a different direction you'll get cleaner water. The others, the RO water and what have you, should all actually have a TDS reading of 0, so they're absolutely perfect for topping off. And it's actually incidentally why they use RO water for topping off marine aquaria, because you need that level of purity, so it's really good for that. Okay, that's the very basic how to prevent these minerals and subsequent TDS from rising. But what do you do if your TDS levels have already risen well above that of your water supply? Well, the first thing is, don't panic. It's really not one of those things that's going to wipe your tank out eventually. It's one of those things that has a sort of long wearing effect that will cause things to deteriorate, but it's not a sudden thing. However, it is one of those things that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed in the right way. Fortunately, once again, the solution is actually quite simple, except this time, instead of simply changing the water you top off with, you need to actually change water. Now, I know from experience, again going back to the shop days, that the inclination at this point, or the natural inclination, is to do a huge 90% water change to actually try and correct this in one go, or even more extreme, maybe to clean out the entire tank and start again. But quite honestly, neither of these things are likely to end well, and I know from experience generally don't. So firstly, when you're changing water, you want to use the original water supply, not the ones that are like the RO water, etc. You actually want the original water supply that has the minerals in it that you started with. If you start changing large amounts of water with the RO water, etc., that I recommend for topping off, you'll end up with wildly different water to you started with, and you'll potentially open a whole new can of worms. So it's not something I would recommend for most people anyway. So how much water needs to be changed? As I said, you really must avoid doing a really big water change at this point, because it will shift the TDS far too quickly back in the opposite direction, and this will really shock your fish and everything else that's living in the tank, and it really won't do them any good. So personally, I'd never change more than maybe 20% at a time. Something like that is normally fine. And depending on how great the difference is between your water supply and the tank, it might actually take quite a few water changes to bring these two in line, but it's much better and much safer to do this gradually over quite a few different changes. but you can safely change, as I say, around 20% every few days if necessary. But always remember, if your water is treated with chlorine or chloramine, your water supply that is, that you need to condition it beforehand. There are also a few other things that I feel like I need to mention. Firstly, the actual design and where you keep your aquarium can actually have really quite a big impact on how big a potential issue this is. Prevention is one of those things that I feel is really important, because ultimately it simplifies the aquarium experience, and I think ultimately it makes it much more pleasurable. One of the biggest things that actually exacerbates this problem and really increases it is actually increased evaporation. Subsequently, if you have an open top tank and top off with mineral rich tap water, the TDF levels will actually go off the chart really quite incredibly quickly. And I know from experience, it actually happens at literally an order of magnitude faster than if you have a well covered tank with a good fitting lid. So definitely bear this in mind when choosing a tank. Open top tanks can be much more work, and especially in this regard. And for much the same reason, you'll also find that tanks using air-driven equipment tend to become much more of a problem more quickly too. Again, just simply because they cause more evaporation. But even very simple things like the room temperature actually has an impact. If your aquarium is actually much warmer than the room temperature, you'll get much more evaporation than if the room temperature is quite similar to your aquarium. Now, one of the things that I actually haven't mentioned, and I've actually just left to the end, is what do you do in the rather rare event where the TDS actually falls? Well, again, it's actually quite simple. And instead of topping off with RO water, I simply top off with my original tap water supply that contains minerals. Basically, this just helps to push that content back up again so that your TDS rises slightly instead of falls. And in fact, sometimes over the long term, and especially with tanks like this 28-year-old one, I actually end up doing a little bit of both. It's actually incredibly simple. All I do is, when the TDS rises a little, I top off with rainwater, and when it falls a little, I top off with my hard tap water. It really is that simple. And in that way, I'm able to keep the levels stable and consistent, really incredibly easily, literally 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's really that easy to do. And also, I think I must mention that for those of you who have extremely soft water with a very low TDS level to start with, a lot of what I've just talked about may actually take a very long while to actually become an issue. But it's definitely still one of those things that you want to be aware of, because it can still occur even with surprisingly soft water. While those of you with very hard water can actually experience this with, in actual fact, just a few weeks, and especially if you have a very warm open top tank. If you'd like to know more about my naturally balanced, no water changed, unfertilised aquariums, I'd be eternally grateful if you'd subscribe and give me a like. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.